Our theme today is do not judge. Now it's interesting, and it's a very important theme, I think, and also in the day and age we live, because we are all guilty of this. I know I'm guilty. For somehow we always seem to be able to judge each other, whether it's in a small way. Sometimes we do not even realize that. Sometimes we do not even notice that in our hearts. But there's something that often just happens, and we need to take notice of that, because the Bible speaks about this topic very clearly. It's interesting, whether or not to judge is, like I said, it's a hot topic today in our lives. Most of us would say that we are not the judge of our fellow Christians, especially when it comes to Christians. We would say, I do not judge someone else. However, that is what we are. That is not always what we are practicing. We say we don't, but often we do. And I think it's something we need to take notice of. The question is, do we pass judgment on others without even noticing it? That's an important question. C.S. Lewis wrote about how does this work? I'm using the wrong button. Okay, C.S. Lewis wrote once, one of the marks of a certain type of bad man is that he cannot give up a thing himself without wanting everyone else to give it up. That is not the Christian way. An individual Christian may see fit to give up all sorts of things for special reasons, marriage or meat or beer or the cinema. But the moment he starts looking down his nose at another person who do use them, he has taken the wrong turning. And that's an interesting remark by C.S. Lewis, because it seems that it also, we are often guilty of this as well. Maybe for a time we decide not to do something, not to eat something, not to go to a certain place. But when other people do things like that, we seem to look down on them for some reason. It's easy to say, I'm not judging you, but when people's back are turned, we sometimes judge them a couple of times before the next Sunday service arrives. And we do not even realize that. See, in our text today, James proposes two things. He says, first of all, he asks the question, who are we really judging when we do that? The next thing is, he basically makes a statement and says, God alone is judge. James, our text this morning is in James 4, verse 1 and 2. I'm just going to read that together. It's not 2:12, it's 2:2. Brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. But when you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? And he ends with that important question. See, our job is to be concerned with where we are in our relationship with God. And let God worry about other people, in one sense of the word. So the question is, who are we really judging? Now, in the 20-odd years I've been ministering, in part of ministry, I've met many broken people. People who have been hurt by the church, people who have stopped going to church, people who have been rejected by the church. And I've seen a lot of hurt and a lot of pain in churches. And sometimes we mistreat people in churches. Sometimes we look down upon people in church. Sometimes we reject people in churches. And it seems almost as if it's a thing that we do when we not often even realize that when we do that. So there's a specific problem being we're confronted this specific problem basically of judging people basically violates the ninth commandment in the Bible. It says, do not testify falsely against your neighbor. And that's important that we must understand that. It violates the ninth commandment. Also violates a more fundamental law of Christ, which is love your neighbor as yourself. We mistreat people. We look down on people. We reject people sometimes. For the way they look, the way they act, maybe the way they speak, maybe the way they there are so many different things why we sometimes just reject people or why we judge people. It says we try to figure out out just how many people have turned away from Christ because of us sometimes. Maybe the list will be quite long. And also for this reason, frankly, for this reason that Nancy and I was at a certain point in Odessa also part of a church plant. We started a church called House of Restoration Fellowship because we felt there were so many hurting people around that were hurt by churches, that we wanted to create a safe haven for people, a church where people can feel loved and accepted. And so I have a passion also sometimes for people. Not saying those people are always the easiest people to work with, never said that, never will say that. But we have a lot of people who have been rejected and who felt that they are being judged by churches. There must be similar reason behind Paul's writing, James's writing in this passage. And there possibly was, in these two verses, probably there was an incident. Maybe there's something happened in that church, perhaps several incidents. And James is dealing with that in this text. It says, look what it says in verse 11. It says, brothers, do not slander one another. And that slander can also speak evil in the New Living Translation. Do not speak evil against each other. Anyone who speaks against his brother or judges him speaks against the law and judges him. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. And that's important that we should understand that. It says, basically, James is making a quick turnaround here, because if you look in the previous verses, in verse 7, he just speaks about first our relationship with God. In verse 7, he says, basically submit to God. In verse 8, he says, come near to God. In verse 10, he says, humble yourself before God. And then suddenly in verse 11, he just makes a turn, and he turns to our proper relationship between believers. See, verse 11 is very clear. It says, do not slander or speak evil against each other. You see, we love God. We love God, don't we? Yes, we do. We love God. And we humble ourselves before Him. But we also need to love our neighbor and refuse to speak evil against our neighbor. So when we speak evil against people, what do we do? Wrong button again. When we speak evil against people, what do we do often? We may speak the truth about someone because you feel you may be speaking the truth, because that might be some person might have reacted in the way and you might just have said it. So from your point of view, you think you spoke the truth. But you can still be unkind when you speak the truth. You can still spread gossip that you have no business of knowing about. You may also maybe questioning someone else's authority when you do that. Or you may be nullifying the good work by backbiting people. And all doing that by thinking you are still doing the right thing. You see, so there are different reasons how we can speak evil, different ways how we can speak evil against each other, not even realizing that we are hurting people, or we're doing the wrong thing, or they feel hurt, or they feel it. Gossip can spread very quickly. You think you're doing the right thing, but it's a gossip. You start, and you're hurting people through that gossip. You see, obviously this hurts harmony amongst us. And that's the thing. The moment that you've hurt someone, you've broken the trust of people around you, at least with that person that you have hurt. See, this hurts harmony amongst us. Interesting that when James uses this word slander. Remember we said here in this word, brothers, do not slander one another. See, that word slander that he uses is a Greek word, katalaleo, and which could include destructive verbal attacks, with our words. It could be a gossip behind someone's back, or just the false accusation that you make. Katalaleo. And such offences are not to be practiced amongst us as Christians. See, James repeats this first verb. You see, where he says, do not slander, that do not slander is katalaleo. But he goes on and he says, or anyone who speaks against. Now that word speaks against is exactly the same word, katalaleo. He uses the same verb there. He says, if you speak against someone, or if you slander against someone, or judges him, you speak against the law and the judges. So what basically James is doing is he makes clear that basically he adds the second verb, or judge, to make clear that the speaking against is basically a form of judging. Because when you speak against someone, you're basically judging that person. See, judging becomes the real focus then of these verses. That's what we're really doing. When you slander someone or you speak against someone, you're basically judging that person by what you're saying in your words without even realizing it sometimes. And the tense that he uses in this Greek, it also kind of gets the idea that this practice is already in progress. So James is dealing with the real situation that probably happened there in that church. And the people were in the habit of criticizing each other probably. And that is why he's speaking about it, because the verb suggests it's an ongoing situation that he's dealing with and he has to speak about it. And that's why he's mentioning that in these verses. These verses includes the 6th and the 7th time in this letter that James mentioned that God's law here. He mentions God's law 6 or 7 times. This is the royal law. Don't forget that. The law that frees or convicts, the law that we must keep, and this law is under attack. The specific problem being confronted with violates the 9th commandment. The 9th commandment that says, do not testify falsely against your neighbor. That's what we are doing. Do not. And it also Matthew 22:39 says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's a fundamental law of Christ as well. So it basically violates these laws when we do that. In Leviticus, when we read Leviticus 19, verse 16 to 18, it says, do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share in his guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Jesus calls this the second greatest commandment. If a believer speaks against another believer, he is criticizing and condemning the law because he does not show love towards that person. See, his disobedience then shows disregard for God's law that said we should not do this. So by doing it, you're basically putting yourself above God when you criticize them. And when we judge another in this slanderous way, we are clearly failing to submit them to God. That's the ultimate thing, what happens there. So, the question is, when we criticize or judge others, who are we really judging? If you think about it, James states we are judging God's law. And if we are judging God's law, who are we really judging? We are judging God, because he is the one who gave us that law. So basically what you're saying is, God, you messed up when you do that. It says, let me fix this for you when we judge other people. And that's how serious it can be. It's interesting that there was these buttons, I'm going to go crazy. There was a story and a little book illustration in Bible Truth. H.A. Ironside pointed out the folly and judgment of others, of judging others. He related an incident in the life of a man called Bishop Potter. He was sailing for Europe on one of the great transatlantic ocean liners. Now, this is basically how I can picture one of those ocean liners, how it must have been when you go into those cabins, and the old cabins in the old times, an older cabin. He was sailing on the transatlantic ocean liner. When he went on board, he found that another passenger was to share his cabin with him. And after going to see the accommodations, he came up to the purser's desk and inquired if he could leave his gold watch and other valuables in the ship's safe. He explained that he never availed himself of that privilege, but he had been in this cabin, and he met the man who was to occupy the berth with him. Judging from his appearance, he was afraid that he might not be a very trustworthy person. The purser accepted responsibility for the valuables and remarked, "It's all right, Bishop. I'll be very glad to take care of them for you. The other man has been up here and left his stuff here for the same reason." I think and that's ironic, because that's what often happens in our lives. You know, I judge you, you judge me, And there's frankly just no basis for it even. And we judge from outside appearances sometimes, as a story just gives us, shows us. I look at you, you look weird, you do not look the same as I do, you don't have the same hairstyle as I do, and so I have to judge you now for that. And you have to judge me for that. And that is so ridiculous if you think about it. Let's go on, let's read Matthew 7. It's interesting that this was the words of Jesus. You see, James not only James tells us not to judge, but Paul tells us to do that, not to do that. Peter tells us not to do that. John tells us not to do that. And look at this passage, and this was Jesus' words. He says, "Do not judge, or you will be judged. For in the same way that you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. For first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So Jesus tells us not to judge others, or we will be judged. He even goes further. He goes as far as to say that the same way, in the same manner you judge others, they will judge you. The same measure that you judge others, you will be judged. And I think it's quite serious if you think about it. So I think we should think about this the next time that we judge other people. He also tells us in this passage to take care of our own issue before we go trying to fix someone else's situation. Have you got the plank in your eye? I see that clearly, but you got something speck in your eye, putting ourselves in God's place, because we want to be the judge. And then we judge God by doing that, and that's not good. Okay. The thing is, God is the judge. It's a nice little picture there. Maybe someone can relate. Chuck Swindle told us of his being at a pastor's conference where he would be speaking. Now, Chuck Swindle, some of you know who that is. He was a very famous, is a very famous Christian pastor. He has a lot of books. I've read quite a lot of his books. The first day, he was to speak at a conference. The first day, there was a man approached him and he said how great he was looking forward to hearing Dr. Swindle speak, and his delight at now finally being able to realize that desire. He was really excited. That evening, Dr. Swindle noticed the man was sound asleep only a few minutes into the sermon. Swindle thought by himself that perhaps the man was tired after a long day's drive and couldn't help himself. But this continued to happen night after night, and Dr. Swindle became very upset in his spirit with this man. And on the last night, the man's wife came up and apologized and said her husband apologized for her husband's inattention to the message. She then explained that he had recently been diagnosed of having terminal cancer, and the medication he has been taking to ease the pain made him extremely sleepy. But he had been one of his lifelong ambitions to hear Dr. Swindle speak before he died, and now he has fulfilled that goal. Friends, it's just a short story, but it just speaks about the ridiculous sometimes of the way we can judge people without even realizing the full situation, not understanding what's going on in the life of someone else. As simple as that. And we found ourselves keep on doing that, not even realizing why we do that, and still it can hurt so much if people realize that. See, James 4 verse 12 says, the second verse says, there is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? Also reminds me of a verse in Ephesians 4 verse 29 that I love so much. Speaks about, do not let unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is good and helpful for building up others. And that's what our words are for. When we have to say something, when we have to react towards something, let it be good and a wholesome talk. Let it build people up, not break people down. Let's try to build each other up. by our words instead of breaking each other down by some things we sometimes say out of control. See this verse, the principle in this verse, chapter, verse 11, or verse 12, does not prohibit action of a church against a member who is acting in flagrant disobedience to God. I think we should understand that. It's not saying that we should overlook sin. I'm not saying we should totally overlook sin by saying we don't have to judge, don't judge anything, just overlook sin. That's not what this verse is saying. It's not that. But rather, James is concerned with the critical speech and condemns or judges our actions and actions sometimes that we take. He is confronting basically individuals who might be tempted to set themselves up as what we call sometimes personal watchdogs on other believers. It's like you feel it's your role, your responsibility to see if everyone is right, if everyone is doing the right thing, if that guy is sitting at the right place, if someone is doing something out of control, it's your job. It's not our job to judge other people. It's not our job to make sure everything is going on and right. We might think that just criticizing a church member or spreading a little gossip sometimes is not that serious, especially if you compare it to other sins. It's just not that serious. Especially, but the Bible sees it as a sin of really seriousness. It's quite serious, and it breaks the law of love, and also usurps God's authority in that way. As we saw in chapter 3, remember when we spoke and looked at James in chapter 3, the tongue is also a tool of deadly sin. We dare not minimize the danger of our tongues, the way we speak with each other. It says when we fail to love, we are actually breaking God's law. So let's examine our attitudes and our actions toward each other. Let's build each other up and not tear them down. I'm also reminded of Paul when I said like this verse 4:29 says, use the right words. Choose to say something wholesome. Choose to say something positive towards someone else. There's another illustration I might like to use. This thing just, for some reason, it gives me both pictures. I wanted the first picture only. There was this boy who was very excited, and he told his mom that he had just measured himself, and he was 6 feet tall. So his mom was a little skeptical and says, all right, now, she said to him, now measure yourself again. Let me just see what's going on. And she discovered that the problem was the boy didn't measure himself with a 12-inch ruler, but he measured himself with a 6-inch ruler. 6 inches. Now, for you don't know, 12 inches basically is a foot. So he thought he was 6 foot tall, but that's really tall. But he actually took the 6-inch ruler, which is like a half a foot. So he was using the wrong measurement to measure himself. And that's sometimes thing that we are also guilty of. We are judging other people, but using the wrong measurement because we use your personal measurement, the measure you have. You think that a person should be like this. You think a person should say these kind of things. You think a person should act in a specific way. But that is your measurement that you measure people by. It's not God's measurement. So often we use the wrong measurement sometimes when we look at people, we speak to people, and we look from our point of view through your glasses. I was born in Africa. Who would say that? If you look at me, most people in Ukraine says, why? First asked the question when I came to Ukraine in 94, they asked me, why are you not black? Yeah, I understand. Most people in Africa are black, but I'm 29th generation South African in South Africa. I am white. My 29 ancestors were black. And people just sometimes just think things and say things and make assumptions just because they look at you, the way you look, the things you say, or the way you act, they make assumptions, and that might be the wrong measurement. See, we often fall in the same problem ourselves. We often judge others by a very different standard than even the one we judge others by. So, because God is the only one who is all-seeing and all-knowing, He has the right to judge. Romans 2 verse 1 says, you therefore you have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge the other, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. That's interesting. Like, we pass judgment, but you do the same things. That which you have judged someone else. Often we fall into the trap that, and it often happens with us as well. You know, you judge other people, you see their mistakes, but you don't realize you do the exact same mistakes by judging in that way. I find myself in that category sometimes. You know, it's interesting that God alone is the judge. What do we see? We see what people wear. We see what people do. We see what people say. And that's basically our limit, because this is man's limit. See, do, and say. If you look at God, we cannot see what their day has been like. We do not know the struggles people are dealing with. We do not know the obstacles they face. We do not see the hurt that they are dealing with. And the last one, important one, we cannot see their hearts. You have no idea what's going on in a person's heart. These are the things that God sees. These are the things that God knows about us, and that we don't. Now, if you think about this, our judgment, you know, if we judge people by the outside character, just by the outside cover of a book sometimes, you know, judge sometimes. No, how many of you just picked up a book and look at the outside and says, nah, it's not for me. I've done it many times. But that's how ridiculous it sometimes is. But the inside of the book, the words that might be extremely interesting, but just the outside is not interesting. Nah, I'm not for it. And that's what we do with people as well. What does God see? He sees a total different picture of us. He knows us fully the way we are. And that is something that we really need to take in consideration. We judge only by what we say. God judges by what He can see. And what He can see is much more than what we do. So we need to stop and recognize that people may be going through things that we have no clue about. We need to stop and take into consideration that person, what that person has gone through. Think about what he has gone through. We need to stop and come to realization that we are not qualified to judge someone else, because we are not God. We cannot judge other people. Rather than judge, we need to pray for people. Instead of judging, we should ask God if there's anything we can help, anything we can do to help people.